Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to tackle a really big one, a question that's been around forever. What is justice?
Yeah, it's one of those ideas that everyone seems to have an opinion on, but it's surprisingly hard to pin down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where we're diving into some fascinating sources today. We've got selections from John Calvin, a major figure in the Reformation movement.
His commentaries on Psalms and Romans, his Institutes of the Christian Religion, really gets into how he saw justice playing out in the world.
Oh, and we've even got a little Seneca thrown in for good measure, just to spice things up.
Always good to get a different perspective.
Right, absolutely. So let's jump right in. I was really struck by something Calvin said in his commentary on Psalm 7. He talks about these acts of divine deliverance, God stepping in to rescue someone from a bad situation.
And it's not just about the rescue itself. Calvin argues that these moments should spark something deeper within us.
Like what?
Well, imagine witnessing a moment of true justice prevailing. It should ignite a sense of awe and gratitude for sure, but Calvin says it should also lead to introspection.
Well, that's interesting, like a moral mirror.
Exactly. It makes us examine our own lives and ask, am I living in a way that aligns with this higher order? Am I contributing to justice or hindering it?
That's a heavy question to ponder, especially when you consider that none of us are perfect.
And that's where Calvin's commentary on Psalm 32 comes in. He introduces this idea of divine forgiveness as the ultimate form of justice.
So it's not just about punishment or retribution.
Right. It's also about offering a path to healing, restoration, and reconciliation.
So true justice can't exist without mercy.
That's a question that really challenges our human understanding of justice, which often focuses on balancing the scales or getting even.
Makes you wonder if our human ideas of justice are even really just.
Well, Calvin would argue that our human understanding is inherently limited because of our flawed nature.
Right. He delves into that in his institutes, doesn't he?
Absolutely. He says that because of our inherent imperfections, we're incapable of achieving true righteousness on our own.
So we're all kind of messed up from the start.
In a sense, yes. We need something more, something outside ourselves to bridge the gap.
And for Calvin, that something is
Christ. He points to Christ as the embodiment of true justice, the one who offers atonement for our shortcomings.
Okay, but if justice is ultimately tied to Christ and God's plan, then what happens to free will?
It's a tricky question for sure, but for Calvin, it doesn't diminish the significance of our choices and actions.
So we still have a responsibility to try to do the right thing.
Absolutely. It's just that our ability to do so comes from a power beyond ourselves.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. But how does this all play out in the real world? How do we see this idea of divine justice working in the lives of individuals?
Well, Calvin uses some interesting examples from the Old Testament to illustrate this point. He talks about stories like Absalom rebelling against King David and Shammai cursing David.
Now, those are some pretty intense situations.
They are, and on the surface, they seem incredibly unjust, especially when you consider that David is portrayed as a righteous king chosen by God.
Right. Why would God allow those things to happen to him?
That's the question Calvin tackles. He uses these narratives to distinguish between God's will and his commandments.
So God doesn't necessarily condone those actions, even though he might allow them to happen.
Exactly. Calvin suggests that God can use even the actions of wicked people to achieve a greater purpose without condoning their behavior.
It's like those stories where the villain inadvertently helps the hero in the end.
Kind of. But it still leaves us with a difficult question. How do we reconcile events that seem unjust with the belief in a just God?
That's something I think a lot of people struggle with, especially when bad things happen to good people.
And Calvin doesn't offer easy answers. He encourages us to take a longer view, to trust in God's ultimate plan, even when we don't fully understand it.
So patience and faith are key.
Absolutely. And hope. He draws on Romans 8.24, which reminds us that we are saved in hope. We endure present hardships with the assurance that God's justice will ultimately prevail.
Even if it's not always obvious in this life. It's a lot to take in. But I'm curious to hear more about how Calvin's ideas challenge traditional views of justice, especially when it comes to the afterlife.
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. So one of the areas where Calvin really shakes things up is his view on purgatory.
Purgatory, yeah, that's a concept that's been debated for ages.
Exactly. And Calvin takes a pretty firm stance against it. He looks at passages like Matthew 12.32, where it talks about an unforgivable sin.
So he's saying there's no second chance after death to make things right. Like, what we do here determines our eternal fate.
That's Calvin's view and has big implications for how we approach justice in this life.
How so?
Well, if we believe in purgatory, we might be more lenient in our judgments. Figure there's always a chance for atonement later.
But Calvin's saying this life is it? Our only shot at getting it right.
Right. It adds a sense of urgency to the whole thing. Makes every choice, every action matter more.
I can see how that would change your perspective. If you believe this is the only road we get, you're going to be a lot more careful about where you step.
Exactly. And it ties into this idea we were talking about earlier, how our beliefs about the afterlife shape our understanding of justice in this life.
Right. It's like our beliefs about the destination influence the journey we take.
Yeah.
If we think there's a shortcut or a detour, we might not be as diligent.
Precisely. Now, shifting gears a bit, Calvin also dives into the purpose of laws within society.
Okay. Interesting. So we're moving from the cosmic to the more practical.
In a way, yeah. He sees laws not just as human constructs, but as reflections of God's will, intended to restrain evil and promote order.
So like a blueprint for a just society.
You could say that.
Ah.
And this is where we see the rubber meet the road with Calvin's theology. He believed that even earthly governments should strive to uphold God's justice.
Meaning?
Enacting laws that protect the innocent, punish the guilty, promote the common good, that kind of thing.
So it's not just about personal piety. It's about creating a system where those principles are embedded in society itself.
Exactly. And that's a challenge we're still grappling with today. How to build a world where justice isn't just an abstract ideal, but a lived reality for everyone.
No easy answers there, that's for sure. But I think these sources we're looking at offer some valuable insights into how we might approach that task.
Definitely. One of the key things that jumps out is this emphasis on God's sovereignty. Justice isn't just about human laws or social contracts. It's ultimately rooted in God's will.
So there's this cosmic order with God as the ultimate judge, making sure things are set right in the end.
You could put it that way, but it's not a passive role. God is actively involved in upholding justice, both through guiding history and through his eventual judgment of all people.
It's a sobering thought for sure, but also kind of comforting in a way, knowing that there's a higher power who sees everything and will ultimately make things right.
And that brings us to another crucial element of Calvin's view. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's also about restoration.
So not just about revenge or retribution, but about healing the brokenness.
Precisely. And this is where grace comes in. God's justice isn't vindictive. It's about offering forgiveness, reconciliation, a path towards renewal.
It's a much more hopeful view of justice than the fire and brimstone image we often associate with divine judgment.
Absolutely. And it challenges us to rethink our own approach to justice. Do we seek retribution or reconciliation? Punishment or restoration?
Tough questions.
Yeah.
But essential ones if we want to move beyond a simplistic understanding of justice.
Couldn't agree more. Now, one thing that really stood out to me as I was reading Calvin was this connection he makes between justice and love.
Love. Now that's interesting. Didn't expect those two to be so intertwined.
Right. But Calvin argues that true justice can't exist without love. He points to the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself.
Ah, so you can't have true justice without compassion, without genuine care for others.
Exactly. And this ties into his view of the Christian life. It's not just about believing the right things. It's about actively living out those beliefs through serving others, working for the common good, fighting for the oppressed.
So it's a much more active and engaged view of justice than just sitting back and hoping for a fair outcome.
Right on. And this leads to another key point that Calvin emphasizes: humility.
Humility. Okay, I'm intrigued. How does that fit in?
Well, he believed that true justice starts with recognizing our own limitations, our proneness to error and sin.
So check your ego at the door before you start talking about justice.
Exactly. Calvin argued that our human understanding of justice is always going to be partial flawed. We need to approach these questions with humility, knowing that we don't have all the answers.
It's a good reminder for all of us, especially in today's world where everyone seems so sure of their own righteousness.
For sure. And beyond individual humility, Calvin also stresses societal humility, the idea that even our best attempts at creating a just society will fall short.
So we should never get complacent, always be striving for improvement.
Right on. He advocated for constant self-examination, both individually and collectively, always looking for ways to make things better.
It's like a call to action. Never stop fighting for what's right, even when it's tough, even when progress is slow.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes these deep dives so powerful. We're not just learning about history or theology. We're engaging with ideas that can change the way we see the world and inspire us to live better lives.
It's like those aha moments when you realize that these ancient texts are still so relevant to our lives today.
Exactly. And it brings us back to our original question. How do we define justice? I think these texts give us a much richer and more complex understanding than we might have had before.
And they remind us that it's not a destination. It's a journey, a constant process of learning, growing, and striving for something better.
Beautifully put. So before we wrap things up, I'd love to hear your final takeaways. What resonated most with you as we explored these ideas?
Honestly, for me, it's the connection between justice and love in Calvin's thinking. It's not just about rules and punishments. It's about something much deeper. Compassion.
Grace.
Those qualities that seem to be in short supply these days.
It's amazing how these ideas from centuries ago can still speak so directly to the challenges we face today. The world might change, but the human heart, not so much.
Yeah. It makes you think about how we approach justice in our own lives. Are we focused on punishing those who wrong us? Or on rebuilding broken relationships?
Calvin would say that true justice can only exist when we recognize the inherent dignity of every person. It's not about getting even. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
It's a beautiful vision.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be easy to achieve.
Definitely not. But I think these texts we've been exploring offer us a guide, a set of principles we can use to navigate these complex issues.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? We've covered a lot of ground. Divine justice, human responsibility, the role of grace.
Well, I think the main thing is this. Defining justice. It's not a one-and-done deal. It's an ongoing journey.
A journey of what?
Of reflection, of examining our own hearts and actions, and of looking at the systems around us with a critical eye.
And ultimately of working towards a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, no matter who they are.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with a final thought to ponder. If true justice begins with the transformation of the heart, how can we cultivate those inner qualities? Love, compassion, humility that are so essential for creating a more just and equitable world.
That's a great question to reflect on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the concept of justice. Until next time, keep diving.